Thank you for joining me. I'm really, really excited to speak with you today. Like when I found your work, I was so grateful because I'm like, nobody talks about this. And it's something that I feel like I've always known because I'm the oldest in my family. And I
Hmm.
felt like I've always kind of understood there's different dynamics between me and my brother and my sister. And I can kind of tell that we're all different. And then when you grow up and you see other people, like even like comparing yourself to your cousins and their brothers and sisters, you see we all
Yeah.
kind of have some similarities and differences. But I believe that I guess what I'm always trying to wrestle with is the difference, like understanding the importance of sibling dynamics and also trying to balance how those dynamics kind of stay or don't stay based on like how you grew up, the things that are around you, the resources that you have and don't have. But sorry, I'm getting into it like really, really fast. But before we get into all that, like how did you start this work? When did you start to notice this stuff yourself and realize like, yo, I need to like dive into this and explore it to see if, was it, were you feeling these things and decided to kind of get into the work, or what was it for you?
Yeah. So sibling work is really deeply personal to me. So I actually am the youngest of 13,
Mm-hmm.
and I come from a blended family system. So I am my mother's second child, but I am my father's 12th child. So when my parents met, my dad had 11 kids. My mother had one, and they came together, had me. But the thing is, my father's children are about 20 to 30 years older than me. And
Mm-hmm.
then my sister from my mother, we just never had a healthy sibling dynamic. So I always grew up feeling like I was an only child.
Mm-hmm.
And as I got older and meeting my peers, I always found that I had friends who also had either really weird sibling dynamics or dynamics where they didn't feel like they belonged in their family system because they were so different from their siblings, or just honestly a lot of conflict, strife, and tension between
Mm-hmm.
them and their siblings. And so I thought to myself, this is work that no one really is focusing on, and siblings make up so much of society, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I really decided, because of my own personal journey, but then also just hearing the stories of other people, what does it look like to give attention to sibling dynamics? If you walk into a bookstore, if you go online to listen to a podcast, there are a plethora of resources on parent child relationships.
Mm-hmm.
There are resources on how parents can build healthy attachment with their children. There are resources on how parents can help to regulate their children's nervous system. There are resources on how to help your child potty train,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there are no resources on what do you do if you don't like your sibling?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do if you're having conflict with your sibling?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do if you feel like your sibling is the favorite and you feel invisible in your family
Mm-hmm.
system? What do you do if you are the parentified sibling and you're so burnt out by parentification, you honestly don't even want to be around your siblings anymore because you've been tasked with taking care of them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so there are so many different dynamics that we can uncover when we talk about sibling relationships. But what brought me to this work, honestly, is just my personal experiences as being the youngest of
Mm-hmm.
13.
Mm-hmm. And I love anyone who takes the things that they've been through and decide to dive into it because I know that it's coming from a really pure place. So thank you. I knew this already. I just wanted the audience to know, just because they didn't know you. But that's why I love your work and thank you for what you do because I think it really helps someone like me who's the oldest. And I kind of, that whole like parentification thing, I can really resonate with that. When it comes to like for myself, like I felt like I was always the one I would dive in and learn because I had nobody to look up to, and then I'm learning as I go because I have no blueprint or nobody to look up
Right.
to. And when I look at one thing that I'm really, really fascinated by is, well, before I get into this question, you said something that was interesting to me. So when you think about all the resources that are out there for parents to parent their children, because parenting is a very easy thing to see. Like, it's like, yeah, this is a mom and a dad. They have kids. They have to make sure those kids stay alive. Like, so, like, there's a bunch of resources for them to do that. But then when you think about siblings, it's almost like when you see a family, you don't think about the dynamics between the siblings. You think about like the parents taking care of the kids. Why
Mhm.
do you think that's something that we miss? And because to me it's fascinating that like your parents raised you, but you probably spend more time with your siblings growing up. And I feel like my siblings helped shaped me a lot by how I had to watch after them, and also how the pressure of them looking up to me, and then our little bickering fights that we would have with each other. So why do you think it's something that's missed, even though it seems like it should be right there in front of us to pay attention to sibling dynamics?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question. I'm still trying to figure out why, to be very
Mm,
honest, with all of the research that I've done. But what I will say is that I think it's a cultural issue. And I think what I mean by that is that parenting is something that our society strives for, right? We talk a lot about the importance of parenting. We talk about the prestige that comes with being able to call yourself a parent. And in many cultures, it's this thing that a lot of people desire and strive for. And it's seen as the ultimate form of success in some
mm,
cultures and traditions, right? And I think because of that, there's been a lot of emphasis on what does it just mean to be a parent, but
mm,
what does it actually mean to parent multiple children and pay attention to the dynamics that those children have with each other. I
mm,
also think in our society, and I can only speak to American society, I do believe that a lot of attention isn't necessarily given to children, right? I
mm,
feel like because of the power dynamic, a lot of things are placed on the adult, which is the parent. So you as a parent, you do have to figure out how to potty train your child. As a parent, you
mm,
have to figure out how to help meet their basic needs. As a parent, these are all the resources that you really need to help train up a child to be a healthy adult. And that is a lot of pressure. And I
mm,
think because of that pressure, there's so much invested in resources around making sure a parent is developing a healthy attachment with their child, making sure a parent is emotionally attuned to their child's needs, making sure a parent can meet their child's basic needs like food, water, shelter, clothing, all of those different things. And I think when you're thinking about sibling dynamics, what you're really paying attention to is the emotional connection between the siblings. You're paying attention to issues pertaining to competition, rivalry, and a sense of belonging. And I honestly feel like those are topics that are newer in our
mm,
society. Just a few years ago, we were told by the US Surgeon General that we're living in a loneliness epidemic. Just a
mm,
few years prior to that, mental health became this big, booming industry that's always been around, but we neglected it.
mm,
We didn't really tend to it. We didn't see the importance of talking about it. So I think what's happening is, when you are a parent, that's a really, really hard job. So I expect there to be resources
yeah.
on how to
Mm,
develop a healthy relationship between you and your kid, because that kid now is going to go out into the world once they're an adult, and you want
mm,
them to be functional
mm,
physically, emotionally, mentally. And that falls on the parent most of the time, right? And so
mm,
there's, of course, going to be a need for so much research and resources. But I think that it overshadowed the importance of
yeah.
also paying attention to the dynamic siblings have, because it's also going to help us understand attachment style. It's also going to help us
Mm,
understand how some siblings make friends. It's also going to help us understand how certain dynamics a sibling has shows up in their friendships or even shows up in their relationships.
mm.
I worked with so many clients who, as you said, they're the eldest sibling, and even in their romantic relationships, they feel like they have to be a caretaker.
Yeah.
Right. Right. You don't trust no one to do anything for you.
Yep.
You're making
Mm,
all of the decisions. You feel like you know better.
mm,
You don't know how to allow someone to take the driver's seat because you've been in it all your life.
mm,
Right. And so we're not even paying attention to how those dynamics now leak into the other relationships we're trying to form. But I am happy that it's being talked about more. And I think the more it's brought to the forefront, we will start to see more research around sibling connections.
yeah, 100%. I 100% agree with you, and I'm so happy that you're doing this work because it's something that I've always kind of felt and seen, especially when I have my own kids. Because I started to see like, oh, okay, like, I can kind of tell this sibling order. There's something actually to this, and for me and my own family, like I told you a little bit earlier, I'm from California, but I'm from the inner city. I was born in Inglewood, was raised all up and down LA. We never had one stable place, and a lot of how my family dealt with things was not to communicate because they didn't have those skills and tools and resources. So now as a man who's 32 now, I can label and identify my emotions and how I'm feeling, and I can like articulate my thoughts. Now I'm having conversations with my younger brother and my younger sister, and I'm understanding how they actually think and how they work. I'm like, oh my God, I never knew you were this inquisitive. I never knew you thought that far ahead. I never knew that I always knew, like my brother, I had a conversation with him 3 days ago. I was like, and I realized he was so good at looking at people and being like, I'm not going to do that because I saw this. And for me, I was like, I'm just out here living my life and I'm just doing what I got to do and I'm learning as I go. And the more that I had these conversations with my siblings, I'm like, man, I'm going to really take this information from my lived experience and make sure that I'm paying attention to my kids. So when they have like those competitive little competitions, or there is like a tugging and pulling of, trying to deal with jealousy and stuff like that. I'm like, all that stuff is normal. It's just they have to learn how to deal with it within the dynamics of their relationship. Whereas when I grew up as with my siblings, it was something that I didn't realize was normal. And sometimes we were punished for it. Sometimes we were belittled because we felt like, because I wasn't allowed to be human because my parents didn't understand that was a part of me being human within the dynamics of my siblings. You know what I mean? So that's why I'm like, this work is so important because, again, like I said earlier, I believe that the emphasis of our parents raising us, there should be the same emphasis with the siblings because a lot of stuff happens in those young years with your siblings. Yeah. And a lot happens. Like I go back and I think about the stuff that me and my siblings dealt with amongst our relationships that we're navigating, but also the things that were happening with our parents in our environment that we had to deal with by ourselves in our relationships. You know what I mean? So it's so important. So that's when I found yourself. I'm like, oh my God, I knew I felt this. And thank God Mina is on this because we need it. One thing I do want to talk about is like birth order and identity. Like you hear all of the things like the oldest, what they deal with. The middle child is like the one who's, kind of forgotten about. And then the younger child is like the one who's kind of like the wild child is kind of like how people present them. How much truth is it to, what have you learned about birth order and what are kind of like the stereotypes versus like what is true because of the order in which things happen?
Right. So, birth order theory pertains to, as what you just said, a family system where there is a eldest child, a middle child, and a youngest child. And so, what happens in birth order theory is the belief that one, the first child, is known to have this very significant role in the family because you made your child a parent. And so you are often seen as this star child, this perfect child, the child who, allowed a parent to be a parent. And so sometimes that child gets what they can perceive as the attention the youngest child normally would get, right? And so they would receive a lot of attention in the home. They would receive a lot of love, nourishment, and care. And so what happens is when a second child is born, according to birth order theory, there is this concept called being dethroned. And so when the second child is born, the belief is that the eldest child is now dethroned because the second child is now receiving all this attention, love, and care. And so now there's this strife and this competition for love because as the eldest child, especially depending on the age gap, that's very important. Depending on the age gap, I was here for maybe 3 years, 4 years, 5 years by myself. And I always got attention. I always got this level of love and nourishment. I got my parent that wasn't so tired. Now my parent has 2 kids. I'm with this tired mom and dad all the time. And I am also finding myself sometimes in conflict with this second born child because I feel dethroned. And the reason why I feel dethroned is because I'm witnessing this child get adequate attention and care that I used to receive. Now, when you have the third child, right, so if that ends up being your last child, there's a theory that it can actually go in 2 different directions. Sometimes this is the child that is nourished with love and care and a lot of attention to the point where they're perceived as very spoiled because within that family system, the parent knows I'm not having any more children. So I
Mm,
have to love on this kid. I have to nourish this kid. But there's also another concept when it comes to the youngest child within birth order theory, which is sometimes that child may not get that spoiled like attention. And that might be because the parent might be drained from resources, they might be drained emotionally, they might be burnt out, and so they actually are not giving the youngest child the adequate amount of care that the first and middle child received. And so
mm,
those stereotypes range, but that's why you have this perception of the eldest child and the middle child is often feeling like the lost child. And that happens also because they're perceived as the child who their role has no significance. So the
mm,
eldest child, you made your parent a parent. The youngest child, the parent knows this is it. This is my last kid. I have to cherish this moment with the kid. Where the middle child is like, well, what value do I have to you? I didn't make you
mm,
a parent. I'm not your last child. So, what is my role in the family? And that's often why the middle child might feel lost. But
mm.
I think it's also important for parents to remember that the reason why these stereotypes exist is because, right, we also want to pay attention to the parenting dynamics and the way parents choose to parent their children.
Yeah,
So
okay.
this is not concrete. This is not a
Yeah, yeah.
guarantee that your middle child is always going to feel lost. Your youngest child is always going to be a spoiled, entitled brat. That's not 100% factual. One
Hmm.
of the things that we have to pay attention to is attachment. We want to make sure that when you're raising children, all of your children have what feel like a secure attachment to the parental figure. If your eldest child, for example, is not developing a secure attachment with the caregiver and they're, for example, experiencing anxious, insecure attachment, they might already be in a state of anxiety where they fear that their caregiver is not going to return to them. They fear their caregiver is not going to tend to their needs. And so now, when you see the second born child, right, you already have anxiety in the parent child relationship because your parent is not really attuned with your emotional
Mm.
needs. So it makes sense that the eldest child might struggle when more siblings are born. And so it's really important to pay attention to the attachment styles we're developing with our children to ensure that our children have a secure attachment with each other, but we also have a secure attachment with our children. That's really important.
Are these attachment styles something that happen over time due to what the kid is experiencing from their parents and their environment? Or is our attachment styles, like, where does that come from?
So, attachment theory is really based on the relationship between the parent and the child from birth. Now,
Mm.
attachment can even start within utero, meaning when you're pregnant, are you talking to your baby? Are you singing to your baby? Are you literally in tune emotionally with your baby? But when a child is born, right? Think about your experiences when your kids were born, right? It's very common to have skin to skin with
Yeah.
the baby. When the baby is crying, you find a way to soothe them. Maybe they need to be fed. Maybe they need a pacifier. Maybe they need their diaper changed. What happens is a child recognizes when they're born that I have certain needs. And I'm recognizing that when I cry, when I scream, when I do certain things, my parent is tending to my need. I'm hungry right now. Oh, my parent fed me. I need to be changed. I can't verbally say that, but my parent is so in tune with me. They know that right now
Mm.
I need my diaper changed. That is how we start to develop a secure attachment. And when a child develops a secure attachment, they are more likely to develop healthier relationships with others because their foundation was built on trust and security. Security is where secure attachment comes from. It is a sense of security in my relationship with my caregiver, knowing that if my parent leaves, I might cry for 5 minutes, but I know they're going to come back.
Mm.
If I have certain needs, I know they're going to tend to those needs. Now, the other attachment styles would be disorganized, which would be fearful, avoidant, anxious attachment, or avoidant attachment. And those other three attachment styles, we call them insecure. attachment styles because there is a lack of security in the relational dynamic between the parent and the caregiver. And the reason why this is so important is because our attachment style can inform the types of relationships we develop throughout life, even with our siblings. And
Mm.
so, if I have an anxious attachment style with my primary caregiver, I might also have an anxious attachment style with my sibling.
Mm.
However, there might also be times where I have an anxious attachment style with my caregiver. But if I'm the middle child, for example, and I have an anxious attachment style with my caregiver because they're not in tune with me, they leave me often, I don't feel security in that relationship. But my big brother always pats me on the back when I'm crying.
Mm.
My big brother always tells me everything is going to be okay. My big brother tends to my needs. I might develop a secure attachment with my brother despite having an anxious attachment with my parent.
Ugh, I'm getting chills. Ugh, I'm getting chills because like now I'm thinking about how complex this is. Like my mom and dad got divorced when I was going into high school, and my sister was, probably 8. My brother was, what? How were you in high school? 14, what? 10, 11, whatever. They were young, and my dad left. And then when I see how my brother and I left with my dad, my brother and my sister went with my mom. And
Oh.
when I see how my brother, their relationship, and how my sister kind of looks at my brother like a father figure, and
Mm.
how I look at my siblings kind of like I'm trying to like close the gap. When I'm hearing you speak, I'm like, oh my God, I can see this.
Mhm.
I see this happening in real time because depending on our attachment styles, like there was trauma, there was like, my mom had me when she was 15. So she was parenting young.
Mhm.
So, she made a lot of mistakes because she was young and doing what she had to do. So for me, it's like I'm watching my parents parent as the oldest. I'm like, this doesn't feel right how they're talking to me and doing it, but like it's all that I know. And man, maybe I'm looking for these things in my older life, in my adult life. They're like, oh man, like I don't feel, because I've always said, I've never looked at my parents as like superheroes. I never looked up to them. And a lot of people always said that. I'm like, I never looked at my parents like that. They were just like, they took care of me. They did what they had to do. And I was always trying to find who it was that I'm looking for to follow. And I think it's because, again, having young parents, did they make me secure? Yeah, by taking care of the basic needs. But as far as like the closing the gap and having the conversation, my parents didn't do that for me because they didn't have the skills. And I'm not mad at them for that, but now it's my responsibility to look at it and be like, okay, well, I know what I want to give to my 3 daughters. So I'm always like closing the gap as soon as I can. And that's why I'm getting chills, and I just know how important this work is that you're doing, because this stuff needs to be talked about so we know how to navigate our lives with our siblings, with our spouses, and any relationship that we really encounter. Like, how much does birth order actually shape who we become, and where does like environment, family dynamics, or even life circumstances start to override that?
Right. So I'm really happy you asked that question, which is why I always tell people please don't get hung up
Yeah.
on birth order theory. It
Hmm.
literally is a theory, and it's a theory that exists to pretty much examine the significance of birth order within a family system. But
Mm.
we also have to take into account, as you said, environment, socioeconomic status. Studies even show that sometimes when a parent is more well off financially, the first child might
Mm.
get more resources, but when they add more children to the family system, those resources become strained. So that's also why you might see studies where the eldest child is more likely to go to college or have a better job or a better career. We also have to assess and say, well, are they the eldest of 10 kids or the eldest of 5 kids? Because
Yeah.
we have to pay attention to, did the parents have the resources to invest in the other children the way they did the first child,
Mm.
right? We also have to take into account that no child, even if they're born in the same household, is parented by the same type of parent, right? I know
100%.
so many people who gave birth after the pandemic or during the pandemic. That was such a stressful time on our mind, on our emotions, and on our bodies. We also know that during the year of 2020, we weren't just dealing with the pandemic, we were dealing with the murder of George Floyd and the
Mm-hmm.
racial trauma that was coming up for people. And so that rewires your nervous system. And so the parent that you had 5 years ago, right, the eldest sibling probably had a more nourished, self attuned parent. Now you have a child or toddler, or you're giving birth during the height of the pandemic, you're stressed, you're burnt
Mm-hmm.
out, right? And that second child or those other children may not get the parent that the eldest child receives, because life
Mm-hmm.
circumstances changes who we are, right? And that applies to how the child is then raised and then can shape their personality. So birth order is literally a small thing on the spectrum to
Mm-hmm.
help us understand personality. And a lot of that starts to shape around the ages of 3 to 5. By age three, 80% of our brain is already developed, which is why early childhood care is so, so important, right? Because by then, you are seeing a child who is learning not only their ABCs and one, two, threes, they're learning love, they're
Mm-hmm.
learning trust, they're learning safety, right? And so after that, they're also developing these skills so that they can learn relational skills, that they can develop more relationships with their peers, but also with their siblings. And so we do want to take into account things like finances. We want to take into account environment, and that could literally be your socioeconomic status. That could be your racial environment. That could be your environment, such as your living circumstances, who you're living with. We also have to take into account different forms of trauma. Was there a death of a parent? Is there a separation, as what you just said? All of
Mm-hmm.
those things can shape personality, especially when it's happening at a very young age, because by age 5, almost 90 to 95% of the brain is developed. Okay. And then it continues to develop up until age 25. But
Mm-hmm.
those early childhood years are so significant. This is why, as a therapist, we do something called the Adverse Childhood Experience Exam to help assess from ages 0 to 18. Did you experience a divorce in your family? Did a parent go to jail? Were your basic needs met as a child? Because all of those things are going to influence who you are as a person. It's not just because you're a middle child that you're ending up a certain way.
It seems like with birth order being the thing that people love to attach themselves to, right? Everybody wants to like herd to an identity so they can have
Yeah.
a community of people that they can relate to. And the more that I listen to you speak and the more that I watch your work, I'm just like, what do you say to people who are identifying themselves in this role as a middle child, oldest child, youngest child, but don't feel that role really, or probably overly feel that role? What would you tell them? Like, how can they
Yeah.
take a step back to realize, I guess, who they are in the sibling dynamic outside of the order in which they're in?
Yeah, I think that's really important to be able to have an identity outside of just being the eldest child,
Mm-hmm.
outside of just being the middle child or the youngest child, right? I think one, for people who are really attached to those labels, as a therapist, I'm always trying to uncover why,
Mm-hmm.
because labels make us feel safe.
Yeah.
Labels help us understand who we are, the complexity of life, and it also helps us identify our role. But the disservice sometimes is we become so attached to the label, we fail to realize we can be a different person. So, yes, you are the eldest sibling. It's not always true, however, that the eldest sibling is the parentified child. Sometimes it's the youngest child who finds themselves being parentified because maybe the eldest sibling is struggling with substance abuse disorder. Maybe the eldest sibling doesn't have financial security. There are so many factors that can play a role in the roles and identity that a sibling has. So, one, I'm always questioning, what is the label and why do you identify with that label? Tell me more about your childhood experiences
Mm-hmm.
to be able to identify, why do you feel like as the eldest child that automatically means you were parentified? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes too, when we're attached to these labels, we sometimes fail to see that it's possible that your youngest sibling also was parentified, but in a different way,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you, as the eldest, and not saying you particularly, but in a family role where there's different genders, it's possible that the eldest daughter was required to provide emotional attunement and emotional support. But it's possible that if the youngest in the family was a boy, he was required to provide the family with financial resources,
Mm.
right? So we also have to think about customs and traditions that impact families, because a big part of my work is helping siblings understand the sibling dynamic. And I think when we are overly attached to these roles, we sometimes fail to see the roles our siblings are playing. And so we're like, I was a parentified child, and we're angry and we have all of these emotions. And the youngest sibling is like, I was the invisible child. Or I was also parentified too. I was required to pay the rent, pay the bills. You were just required to make sure that nobody was fighting. Right. And so this is why that conflict often comes up, is because sometimes we pull out our measuring stick and we say, my
Hmm.
pain is greater than yours, instead of saying, we both have pain in this moment based off the roles we were required to fulfill. And that wasn't fair to either of us.
Hmm.
Right. Because I didn't put you in that role to be my parent. My parents did. At 5 years old, I didn't say for to you, 10-year-old you had to parentify me. Right. And so I think that when we, one, strip ourselves of the label, we are also able to assess, one, why does that label exist? How does that label sometimes provide us with comfort? And then we want to be able to assess what, by being addicted to this label and being overly attached to this label, how am I in many ways dismissing the needs of my siblings because I'm failing to realize they had stuff going on too.
Hmm.
It wasn't just me.
Yeah. Oh man. Phew. Yeah, that's so powerful. Oh, that's so powerful because like the more that I just think, I keep having these visions as a kid with my siblings and how like we just didn't have the skills to like talk amongst each other. And when I think about kind of how my siblings and how I move in our adult life, I'm just like, man, like it all makes sense. It all makes sense, and it just makes you want to just give them big hugs of like, yo, we made it and we did it, and our parents did a good job with what they had, but we got some stuff we need to work on that can help us outside of our own outside of our own dynamic. Like
Right.
it's such powerful stuff, and I have all these emotions of feeling sad and I feel really encouraged. I'm feeling motivated, but I'm just like, dang, man, like this is heavy and it's a lot. One thing that I like to think about is the difference in like gender and sibling dynamics. Like if you're a mother who raised all boys, or if you're a mother who raised all girls, or if there's a mix of gender in the kids that you have, like how does gender make up for our siblings, like shape how we see ourselves growing up, like
Yeah. I
especially
mean,
around things like emotions, roles, or
mhm.
how we, or even expected how we show up. You know what I mean? Like does gender play a huge role in the dynamics of siblings?
It can. It absolutely
Okay.
can, due to culture and customs.
Okay.
And so if you're born into a cultural system where they believe that a woman is supposed to be nurturing, emotionally attuned,
Mm.
you might start raising up a daughter that engages in people pleasing behaviors and feels responsible for the emotional needs of others, including their siblings. Right. So there are some cultures that believe from the moment a young girl is born, she's supposed to be prepared to be this nurturing wife, this nurturing woman, this nurturing mother. And it starts off in childhood. Sometimes this is happening consciously, and sometimes it's also happening subconsciously. I do want to say that too. So that's why
Mhm.
it's also important to pay attention to, are we only putting expectations on the girls that we're raising in the home and just neglecting the boys by saying, well, boys will be boys, right? Are we doing that in the home, or can we assess and pay attention to the fact that this might just be a cultural upbringing that I'm used to that I might have to break? Going
Mm.
back to the concept of boys are just boys, right? There are times where in sibling dynamics, boys may feel as if their emotional needs were not met because they were not allowed to express emotions, but their
Mm.
sisters were. So you might find some conflict there where you might feel like you have a sibling with avoidant personality traits, like an avoidant attachment style, where you can tell they want closeness, but they retreat a lot. You can tell that they want to have a healthy relational dynamic, but they may fear there is a lack of trust and safety to be emotionally vulnerable because maybe when they were emotionally vulnerable as kids, they were scolded for it, they were
Mm-hmm.
spanked for it, they were yelled at, and they find that they didn't get the same type of care their sisters received when they were experiencing strong emotions. Especially, for example, if you were a boy who cried, again, you might have been heard, you're not allowed to cry, but you're witnessing your sister being allowed to cry. So that causes
Mm-hmm.
some confusion for a
Mm-hmm.
child. Going back to what I also said before, a lot of siblings may feel that parentification only applies to eldest daughters and they don't see how it applies to eldest sons. But sometimes in a family dynamic, an eldest son is also now being raised to be a man, not
Yeah.
a boy. You're still a
Yeah.
child. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that eldest son is expected to be a protector of the younger siblings. They're also sometimes expected to be a provider, not just for the elder siblings, but sometimes they might be put in a role to be a provider for the family, right? Especially
Mm-hmm.
if hardship hits, if there's a
Yeah.
divorce, if there's a death, you're the big brother, you need to step up. But they may not have those expectations if you were the eldest daughter, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so again, all of this is varies depending on the family system because again, every family has their own culture and custom around how they approach family and how they approach raising children. But these are some dynamics we can see when it comes to gender roles in a family system and the roles that siblings might play.
Mm-hmm. Is there any kind of like for sure thing that all families are dealing with even with different culture, different like socioeconomic statuses, different environments? Like, is there anything that's everybody's dealing with this within like the gender kind of dynamics, or it all varies because of how different culture, socioeconomic status, and stuff like that is?
I think from my work, there's a lot of things that vary for a variety of reasons, but I ultimately find that the emotional needs and the attunement and the attending to emotional needs within family systems are often difficult. So, as you
Yeah.
just talked about, right, I find that to be a very universal thing. And as you talked about, right, coming from a family that sweeping things under the rug is normalized,
Mm,
right? And so now as a result of that, you struggle with healthy communication, you struggle with conflict and problem solving. You
mhm.
struggle with getting your emotional needs met and talking about your emotional needs. And now that leaks over into other family dynamics. And so I find that regardless of race, regardless of religious practice, regardless of different culture and customs, I do find that emotional attunement and pretty much the mental health of the family system can often be overlooked and or it's a thing that a lot of people struggle with. How
Yeah.
do I tend to the different needs within this family system, especially if you are within a family where the system might be a little complex, where there's more than three kids, you have a lot of children in the household. Also, considering what happens when you're a part of a blended family, maybe there was a
Hmm.
divorce, maybe there's infidelity. Do I claim that sibling? Do I not claim that sibling? But there's anger at the parent for cheating. There are so many different dynamics, but all of that comes down to can we regulate our nervous system enough to handle this in a healthy manner?
How does okay? How does oh man, I don't even know how to ask this question because it's like so complicated. Okay, how can parents regulate their nervous system hearing this information as they're listening? How can they start with that so they can at least get a bird's eye view on what they need to do for their kids in their sibling dynamic?
Yes, that's a really good question because that's the key,
Hmm.
especially since children learn how to regulate from their parents. So that's a really good question. So there are different ways that we can learn to regulate our nervous system. We have self regulation, but we have co regulation. I'll start off with self regulation. Self regulation is pretty straightforward. Where it's learning to engage in tools that you're utilizing by yourself to be able to take your body out of survival mode, to take your body out of fight, flight, or freeze, and engage the body's parasympathetic nervous system so that you are tapping into rest and digest mode. And the reason why this is important is because when we're dysregulated, our prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain, goes offline. And that is the part of the brain that is responsible for problem solving, decision making, impulse control. So you see why it's very important that we regulate, because if that part of the brain is off, we're going to be making some wacky decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so self-regulation, the number one tool that I teach parents is breathing exercises. And the reason why I do that is because no matter where you go in life, you bring your body with you. And so I think it's important to understand the same body that you hurt in is the same body that you heal in, but you need to learn how to tap into those tools, right? Because sometimes we get so hyper focused on the hurt our body is feeling, we fail to realize this same body has the tools to help us heal. It's not all about the pain that you're feeling.
I'm sorry, but that line you just said, that body that we hurting is the same body that heals us. Oh my God, put that on a shirt and let's just like wear it all day. It's like that is such a hard thing to accept, because the thing that is hurting, you want to get far away from it, but you can't. You can't. Like one of the phrase that I probably say the most is I'm always willing to look in the mirror. It is the hardest thing to do, especially when you feel like the way that you are isn't your fault, or this thing that happened to me isn't fair. The way that I'm behaving isn't how I would like to behave, but it's all that I know. And then when you deal with those things and look in the mirror and know that it's up to you to change them, and you got to backtrack and look at your childhood, look at why those patterns are that way, it is so hard. And again, that is the pain. That is the hurt, is realizing that that's what it is, and it's up to you to change it. So when you said that, I'm like, oh my God, that is so true. How can, sorry, I don't want to ask another question. I'm sorry that I cut you off. Like that just hit me. Do you want to keep going? Sorry.
It's okay. I'm really happy that resonated, and I hope it resonates for the people listening, because that is the truth of the matter, right? Like when we can recognize that the same body has the capacity for pain, it's also the same body that has the capacity for love, care, nourishment, all of the things that makes us feel good. And so the first step is being able to, one, regulate by doing breathing exercises, box breathing, breathing from butterfly breathing. There are so many different breathing techniques that you can literally do on the go when you find yourself feeling dysregulated. And so breathing techniques, I find, is the number one thing that can really help us put the body in rest and digest mode. There are other things that we might need to do, such as journaling, writing our thoughts out. But I also sometimes encourage people to engage in audio journaling, because when you speak out loud and play it back, you can hear the discrepancy in your thinking. Everything isn't all bad. In your mind, it sounds all bad. When you say it out loud, you might be like, oh, I think I'm over exaggerating a little. I think I'm making that bigger than it needs to be. I think I'm engaging in what we call cognitive distortions, where I probably feel upset right now because I made an assumption and I don't even have the facts. So I'm anxious and agitated and irritated based off stories I'm telling myself. But I'm able to identify it because I'm talking out loud. Now, going to the talking out loud piece, therapy can also be very, very important for self-regulation, because what you just said is important. Some of us are carrying wounds that we don't even realize exist. And those wounds come from our childhood. Those wounds come from the fact that maybe I did have emotionally immature parents. And I'm finding that in all of my relationships, everybody says I don't communicate well. Well, that might tell us a little bit about your history. Sometimes you are the problem, right?
I always say, like, if 100 people saying one thing about me, okay, at some point it's true. I can't keep denying it. Like, it's true, and that's a hard reality to face. But it's like everybody's not saying this for no reason. Like there has to be some truth to it. So again, going back to what I always say, I got to look in the mirror and see, okay, why is this true? And do I have the tools to change it? And if I don't have the tools, I'm going to go look for them, because I don't like that people feel this way. Like, I don't like that I'm that way. But most of the time, it's not your fault. Like, it's really not your fault most of the time. But what is your responsibility is to change it. And that is a hard thing to deal with. Like, that's a really, really difficult thing to deal with. One thing I do want to ask is, I've done a lot of these things that you say, like the audio journaling, the regular journaling. I've sometimes when I go on my walks, I'll speak out loud so I can hear my thoughts. But I do remember how difficult it is in the beginning to do breathing exercises and you are so in your head that you cannot even focus on the breathing or the exercise that you put in front of you. So what would you say to someone who's starting these new exercises, breathing, journaling? How can they get out of their head and just focus on the actual exercise or drill?
So sometimes when you're doing breathing exercises, being in your head sometimes is okay.
Okay.
And the reason why is because the thoughts that you might be having are a guidepost for you to reflect and assess the core wound. And so if you find that you keep coming back to this same thought, it's possible it's a thought you keep running from. And even when you're trying to regulate, even when you're trying to manage your emotions, this thought is just nagging at you because you keep running from that thought. This thought is nagging at you because you keep avoiding finding the resources to solve that problem. So
Mm.
I always say be in tune with the thoughts that are crossing your mind so that you can be aware and assess, am I having this thought because it's a thought that actually just needs to be addressed? Am I having this thought because
Mm.
it's something that's bringing me a lot of pain? And do I need to just sit in that pain? Do I need to allow myself to cry while I breathe? Do I need to allow myself to just be sad in a moment? Because there's one thing I always tell my clients is they'll always say, Mina, how do I know I'm healing? How do I know I'm getting better? How do I know? Because it's not working. It feels so hard. And I'm like, the problem here is that often we think healing means things are going to be easy. And so when we find ourselves having bad days, when we find ourselves thinking about the situation, when we find ourselves crying, we disregard that as a part of the healing process because we tell ourselves, in order to be good, in order to heal, in order to be regulated, my thoughts have to be pure 100% of the time and I have to be smiling all the time. But that's not realistic because you're carrying pain. So why would the pain not show up? And so I
Mhm.
just always tell people, depending on what thoughts you're having, you might want to address what those thoughts are. But if it's a thought that you find that's really distracting to you being able to regulate, this is where healthy escapism comes in. So, this is where you might say, I need to meditate to some music right now. I need to turn on a TV show that can distract me from my thoughts. I need to read a novel or listen to an audiobook that is going to allow me to be grounded. And again, I'm not avoiding the problem, but in this moment, what I need is to be able to regulate because I have a task to do. I have to get on a
Mhm.
podcast right now. I can't be crying, right? I have
Mhm.
all these things that I need to do in this moment that I do have to find a healthy distraction. And that's what we call healthy escapism, where you're escaping from reality and escaping from things that are causing you pain, but utilizing healthy practices where you can regulate your nervous system versus maladaptive practices that causes you to engage in self-harm or self-sabotage. Because if you're having a bad day, healthy escapism might look like I'm going to listen to an audiobook versus, you know what, I'm going to go to happy hour and order 6 drinks.
Mhm.
That's going to
Mhm.
keep you in a state of anxiety. It might feel good in that moment. That hangover is not going to feel good. The anxiety that comes after drinking a lot's not going to feel good. So we
Mhm.
want to make sure that we're just utilizing healthy practices in the moment. And sometimes healthy escapism is what we need when we feel like right now I just don't have it in me. But I'm going to
Mhm.
get to it later. But right now I need some form of distraction so that I can be the regulated person I need to be in this moment.
Mhm. Oh man, this is it's so much work but it's so worth it. Like as I'm listening to you speak, like I'm somebody I love self-development. I'm constantly doing these things, but it's a lot of work. Like I dealt with my first, experience with depression like a month ago, and it was the first time where I couldn't get up. Like my body was able, but I literally just couldn't get up, and I realized, like, oh, I think I'm depressed, and I found out that I was, and I was kind of battling with all these things that we're talking about, doing that work, and how looking in the mirror can be exhausting. And I'm thinking about, like, as I'm doing this work or people who are doing this work, you start to realize that as you kind of find out who you are, you realize that you're different from your family. And when you start to realize that, there's this scarcity that comes in. It's like, oh my God, like how will I be viewed when I start to talk different, or my morals are not the same. My faith and religion isn't the same anymore. And the way that people identify me and my family isn't the same because I'm stripping the things that I was taught. I'm stripping the things that I viewed. I'm stripping my everything. And you've talked about this before, and I was want to talk about it a little bit before we have to go. Is what what does it look like to grow into someone different than your family, and how do we make peace without disconnecting from them? Because that is such a hard thing to do. I remember
Yeah.
just coming back to my family after leaving. I was the first person to graduate high school and go to college in my family, and I'm going from a small town called Bombay Beach in California, where there's no Caucasian people, to coming to Minnesota, where it's all Caucasian people. I'm learning about different things like politics and the world and all these things that we didn't talk about. And I go back home, I'm like, yo, I'm different. And I really struggle with that. So how does someone deal with that without like accepting that they're changing and not disconnect from their family?
Yeah, well, at the core of every human desire is a need for belonging. And that's what you're speaking to. It's knowing
Mm,
that I can still belong a part of my family system without feeling exiled or ostracized just because I have different cultures, customs, belief systems, values, or just way of being from my family. Because often our nuclear family kind of shapes us to be the same, and often your parent is raising you with certain values and belief
hmm
systems. And when you start to break from that, people might have things to say. And it can be a very uncomfortable place. But that discomfort comes from knowing that we still want to belong. We still want to be cared for by this family system, but we also want this family system to make room for knowing that we are different. And so I do think there's a lot of grief work that comes with recognizing you do have different belief systems from your family. You engage in healing different from your family, and especially those behaviors that you recognize are toxic. You're trying to be the cycle breaker. You're trying to have real conversations instead of sweeping things under the rug. You're trying to hold people accountable or expect them to hold themselves accountable, and they're too emotionally immature to do so. So it can also become a very lonely space to be in, and it puts you in a predicament where you're now grieving and engaging in what we called ambiguous loss, where your family is physically present, but it kind of feels like they're psychologically absent because you are on different psychological fields. And so you are emotionally mature, you're self-attuned, you're engaging in community care, you're developing these healthy practices, while it can sometimes feel as if your family isn't doing any of the work. And also sometimes there's grief because you become disinterested now.
hmm
Like, I don't even want to call and tell you, I don't even want to go to Thanksgiving dinner because it's just going to be chaos. And it's something that I've done so much work to regulate my nervous system. I don't want to be in an environment that's going to re trigger me. So, this is where the importance of chosen family comes in, as well as community care practices, where I always tell people, a big part of my work around siblinghood is recognizing that we have biological siblings, but we also have chosen siblings. The same way we have our biological family, but we also have chosen family. And because belonging is what we're really yearning for and searching for, sometimes we have to choose a family we're not tied to by blood so that we feel accepted, so that we feel heard, so that we feel seen, while also being able to hold space on the other end of recognizing this isn't personal. So let me not see this as an attack against who I am. Let me be able to see this as my family is operating the way they want to operate from their own trauma history, from whatever it is that has happened to them. Their inability to see me for who I am actually has nothing to do with me. And I think that separation is so important because sometimes we over identify with our trauma. And so if we feel excluded, we say, I'm not good enough. If we feel unseen, we say, I'm not worthy. Instead of reframing that by saying, I feel unheard by my family, and it's probably because they're operating from their own system of dysfunction that I've chosen to step away from. It has nothing to do with me, right? It's that concept of I made a mistake, I must be a failure. No, you made a mistake. And so, in the context of family, there's a lot of grief work that comes when you are being the person who's choosing to do something different. But I also think one of the things that we can do to be able to have those nourishing relationships with our family is to also remember too, sometimes we're the ones changing because we're growing. Sometimes we want to be able to assess and look back and say, I used to be just as toxic as they are, but now I'm choosing to be better. And so this is where you can hold compassion and grace and empathy while also being able to say, I have to choose a family because this one isn't fully safe enough for me to exist in as a whole person. And so when I'm around them, I might have to compartmentalize. But around the chosen family, I can be my full self. And since I don't want to be estranged from my family, that just means I have to compartmentalize when I'm around them because they're not ready for the fullness of who I am.
I've never said this on a podcast. I've only said this to a few people, but I feel like I'm being dishonest if I don't say this. When I go back home, I always tell my wife, I have to go home and I have to play the game. Because if I'm myself, I am going to be disconnected from them and they will be uncomfortable and I will be uncomfortable. So I have to go and play the game. I am fully myself when I'm with my family, but I'm not the same anymore. And when I was myself around them, my new self, it made everybody uneasy. I got made fun of for how I would talk. I got made fun of, made fun of is kind of harsh. I would be kind of like, I'll get these looks like, what? I was a really we're coming up on time. I'm sorry. I'm gonna wrap up. I'm gonna wrap up here soon. Last year I went home and I was the oldest. I was kind of rebellious and kind of mean. It's kind of how my family would kind of label me. But again, I was a kid just trying to figure it out. And now I'm really articulate. I really can feel myself and my emotions and label them. So I give my family a lot of advice now. You would never think that it was me that would give advice. And my auntie said CJ was an a-hole. I would never think that he was like this now. You know what I'm saying? So I'm just oh, that kind of shocks me a little bit. You know what I mean? So now as I hear you talk, I'm being able to choose your new family is such an important thing that I wish everybody would just be okay with and not take offense to it because it's a real thing. And I think that you can find family who you can be your new self around and still go back and with your, family and play the game. I have no idea if that makes sense, but that's what I've always experienced.
It absolutely makes sense. I think what you're speaking to is survival, right? We learn to adapt in our environment for the sake of trying to survive in that environment. And I think that it's important to honor those tools because I feel like sometimes we tell ourselves we shouldn't have to do that. There's a lot of things in life we shouldn't have to do. But we recognize if I want to survive in this environment, and when I say survive, I don't mean you're in danger, but we understand that survival pretty much means how can I be regulated so that my body is not in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, right? Because I recognize there's a large sense of discomfort in this environment. And I recognize it's uncomfortable for them. I recognize it's uncomfortable for me. There are some people too where you can develop all the skills that you can to be a better communicator. But if the person you're talking to doesn't know how to communicate, it doesn't matter how healthy you become at communicating, you're going to be talking to a wall because they're going to be defensive. They don't want to hear you. They're going to twist everything that you're saying. They're going to gaslight you. So I say that too, because sometimes we find that in order to develop the capacity to be in certain environments, we also are recognizing what is the thing that's going to allow me to stay in tune with my peace right now. And if I'm in this environment, I know the thing that's going to help me have peace is by playing the game versus forcing other people to be mature enough to accept me for who I am. That's going to be exhausting for me because that's a learning lesson that they have to take on. But I'm making myself responsible for their emotional healing by being in this environment and forcing them to have certain conversations or be a certain way because they can't handle the fullness of who I am. And this is what I mean with the compartmentalizing. Sometimes we have to do that. A lot of us do what you do at work, right? Some of us hate our jobs. We hate our bosses. And what do? We go into work with a smile on our face and we do it. And so it's okay to also apply that in other aspects of life because we recognize that playing a game is what allows you to get through probably 2 hours of what's annoying, 2 hours of what's uncomfortable. But you recognize that you have that chosen family that you can say, deep exhale. And I think that's the piece that's important. If you are constantly suffocated and everywhere you go, you have to play the game, that becomes exhausting. But if you're playing the game for 2 hours, all right, I could do this for a little 2 hours. I'm going to be around my family for a little weekend. It is what it is. I tell my wife, you already know the game, girl. And this is what we're going to do for the weekend. And after that, I can exhale. I can decompress. And that's the key thing that a lot of people are missing, the decompressing. Because if you're stuck in that suffocation, that's going to wear you out and burn you out.
Man, I can talk to you for 5 hours. I wish we did have 5 hours, but we don't. Thank you so much for sharing all this. Like, I cannot thank you enough for the work that you do. It's so important. And I think, like, we started talking about sibling dynamics, and it goes into like the self, and you realize how much your sibling dynamics, your environment, the parents you have shape you. And I can't thank you enough for what you do, and I'm so excited for you to keep sharing. I do want to talk to you at some point. I know we're up on time, but I don't know if like you can counsel outside of New York, because I know there's rules with therapy, but I'm gonna look at your resources and stuff, and like, because if you can talk to me and my siblings or my mama or my dad, it's like we're coming. We are coming because we need it. We need it bad. Before we go, do you have anything coming up, or where can everybody find you?
Well, people can find me on social media. My Instagram handle is Mina_B. Mina is spelled MINAA_B. You can also subscribe to my newsletter, Mindful with Mina, which you can find on my website, minab.com. And you can also listen to my podcast, Mindful with Mina, which is available everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Mina, again, for your work. I would love to talk to you again, because I had a billion questions, but we only had an hour. So maybe in the future we'll talk, but nonetheless, like, thank you so much for what you do and speaking with me today.
Thank you, Said.
Everything works out the way it's supposed to, the way it's supposed to.